Imagine leading a guerrilla army deep in the forested mountains, fighting one of Africa's fiercest anti-colonial wars, and then one day, vanishing without a trace. This is the story of Stanley Mathenge, a legendary Mau Mau general, whose life reads like an adventure novel. Welcome back to Wandia Chronicles. In today's deep dive, we'll uncover Mathenge's journey from a rural village in Nyeri to the battlefields of World War II, into the dense forests of the Aberdares Mountains, and finally into the murky realm of mystery and myth. Before we jump in, make sure to subscribe to Wandia Chronicles for more epic African history tales, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing your comments. Stanley Mathenge wa Mirugi was born around 1919 in Mahiga, Nyeri district, in the central highlands of Kenya. Growing up under British colonial rule, young Mathenge witnessed the injustices that would later fuel the Mau Mau rebellion, land alienation, forced labor, and the daily hum of discontent in Kikuyu communities. Hailing from Nyeri, the same region as future Mau Mau leader Dedan Kimathi, Mathenge was raised in Kikuyu traditions and values, something that would forever set him apart in Kenya's freedom struggle. As a tall, strong young man with a reputation for toughness, he seemed destined for a bold path. In the 1940s, that path led him far from home. Mathenge enlisted in the British colonial army, the King's African Rifles, during World War II, and fought in the Burmese campaign against Japanese forces. Many Kenyans were conscripted or volunteered in WWII, and Mathenge was among those who returned with valuable military experience. Serving in Burma gave him first-hand exposure to modern warfare tactics and disciplined soldiering. He learned how to take orders and how to give them lessons that would prove crucial a few years later. In fact, Mathenge would come to pride himself on having formal military training, a point he felt distinguished him from other rebel leaders who hadn't fought abroad. The war also broadened his worldview. He saw empires rise and fall, and realized the British were not invincible. By the time he returned to Kenya, Mathenge was a battle-hardened veteran with a new perspective on colonial rule. After World War II, Kenya's push for independence was heating up. Mathenge became involved in nationalist politics, aligning himself with the Kenya African Union, KAU, the leading anti-colonial political party under Jomo Kenyatta. He emerged as a key organizer of the clandestine 40 Group, or Anakea 40, a militant wing of the KAU composed of younger nationalists and ex-servicemen ready to take more radical action. In fact, Mathenge rose to lead the 40 Group, channeling his military skills into organizing underground networks of resistance. He also helped found a fighting unit known as the WWII, a band of courageous fighters dedicated to the cause of freedom. WWII roughly means government in Kikuyu, perhaps a hint at their aim to establish their own authority in the land. Mathenge's outlook was proudly traditionalist. Unlike many Kenyan elites of the time who were educated in mission schools and converted to Christianity, Mathenge held fast to the Kikuyu traditional religion and customs. He believed deeply in the power of oaths, ancestral spirits, and the righteousness of the land cause. This traditional streak would shape his leadership style once the rebellion broke out. Importantly, Mathenge was also an uncompromising believer in armed resistance. He was convinced that violence was the only way Kenya could achieve independence. Peaceful protests and petitions had fallen on deaf colonial ears. If freedom was to be won, Mathenge felt, it would have to be fought for. In 1952, the tension between the colonial government and Kenyan nationalists erupted into the Mau Mau uprising, also known as the Land and Freedom Army struggle. The colonial authorities declared a state of emergency in October 1952, cracking down on suspected Mau Mau activists. Mathenge, by now a marked man for his activities, fled to the forests along with other rebel leaders to avoid arrest. There, in the dense forests of the Aberdares Range and Mount Kenya, the Mau Mau guerrilla armies began to form, and Mathenge was thrust into a role that seemed tailor-made for him. By 1953, Stanley Mathenge had become the commander of Mau Mau forces in the Nyeri region, essentially the general of the fighters in the Aberdares. In May 1953, he was named leader of the newly formed Nyeri District Council and its fighting unit, a regional Mau Mau military command. This made Mathenge one of the top 2 rebel commanders. Alongside Field Marshal Dedan Kimathi, who led fighters in the neighboring regions, Mathenge led a large force in the Aberdares forests and was respected as a disciplined, no-nonsense officer. His World War II background gave him a certain authority. He knew how to organize patrols, ambushes, and camp logistics better than most. Under his leadership, Mau units in Nyeri developed a reputation for strategic planning and effective guerrilla tactics, striking colonial targets and melting back into the green maze of the mountains. Mathenge's domain spanned the upland forests where fighters could hide in caves, move under the cover of mist, and launch raids on settler farms or colonial convoys. He advocated for a somewhat decentralized command structure, giving field units autonomy to operate as needed in their areas. This was in contrast to Dedan Kimathi's approach of creating a unified high command. Mathenge's reasoning was likely practical. Communication in the forest was difficult and dangerous, so why not let each regional group make decisions on the fly? He was essentially running a guerrilla startup in the mountains, innovating on the go. And by most accounts, Mathenge ran a tight ship. He insisted on discipline among his men, drawing from his KR training. There would be no unnecessary firefights, no wastage of precious ammunition, and no breaking the Mau code of secrecy on his watch. Life as a Mau fighter under Mathenge's command was harsh and hazardous. The Aberdares forest became both a sanctuary and a prison for the insurgents. They endured cold rains, scant food, and constant danger from colonial patrols. Yet amidst these hardships, the Mau forged an internal society with its own rules and culture. Fighters lived under strict codes of discipline, akin to a guerrilla army training camp in the wild. Oath ceremonies bonded the fighters in brotherhood. Every member swore loyalty to the cause in secret rites, often invoking traditional Kikuyu blessings and curses. Breaking an oath or disobeying orders invited severe punishment, even execution, as maintaining unity was a matter of life and death. Communication was done via trusted couriers and encoded messages scratched on tree bark or sent through forest radio, runners. Mathenge and his lieutenants would hold war councils in hidden clearings at night, planning raids for supplies or attacks on isolated colonial outposts. They developed ingenious tactics, setting up lookouts in treetops, using animal horn blasts as signals, and laying ambushes on narrow mountain trails. Mathenge's men, many of them barely out of their teens, looked up to him as a strict but caring father figure. He was known to enforce a sort of Spartan discipline, for instance, ensuring that food was rationed fairly, and that anyone who stole from local peasants, their own Kikuyu kin, would be harshly dealt with. This discipline helped the Mau survive in the woods longer than anyone expected. If you're finding this journey through history riveting, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button and join our Wandia Chronicles community. We love bringing you these in-depth stories, and your support helps keep the Chronicles coming. Also, drop a comment below to say hi and tell us what country you're watching from. It's amazing to see our global audience tuning into Kenya's history. Now, back to the saga of General Mathenge. Even as the Mau fought the British, another battle brewed within their ranks. A clash of personalities and visions between Stanley Mathenge and Dedan Kimathi. Both men were patriots, both were brave, but in many ways they were polar opposites. Dedan Kimathi, about a year younger than Mathenge, was charismatic, educated, to some extent, and politically astute. He kept a diary, quoted the Bible, and even styled himself as field marshal of the Mau with an almost statesmanlike air. Kimathi had helped form a centralized leadership known as the Kenya Defense Council, and even a Kenya parliament in the forest, basically a governing body for the rebels. He was imaginative and ambitious, envisioning himself as the commander-in-chief of a liberated Kenya's army. Mathenge, on the other hand, was a plain-spoken soldier's soldier, illiterate, traditional, and unimpressed by titles. To him, Kimathi's grandstanding and bureaucratic tendencies felt like a distraction from the real work of fighting. Their rivalry was no secret. In fact, Mathenge openly questioned Kimathi's authority, especially in areas where Mathenge's own forces operated. He viewed Kimathi as a Johnny-come-lately who lacked proper military credentials. Remember, Kimathi hadn't served in WWII, a fact Mathenge pointed out as making Kimathi an inferior military leader in his eyes. Moreover, Mathenge felt Kimathi's style of leadership, mission school educated, blending Christianity and nationalism, went against Kikuyu tradition, whereas Mathenge himself was upholding the old ways. It was almost a generational clash. The modern intellectual versus the traditional warrior. Personalities aside, there were also strategic differences. Kimathi was a fiery idealist. He wanted total victory and was initially against any talk of surrender. Mathenge was more pragmatic. As the war dragged on and casualties mounted, he started considering that perhaps seeking an honorable negotiated end might save lives. This difference became critical in 1955. By that point, British pressure was immense, as we'll discuss shortly. and some Mau Mau factions were contemplating laying down arms. Stanley Mathenge reportedly attempted to initiate secret peace feelers with the colonial authorities in 1955, essentially testing the waters for a possible surrender or truce. Crucially, he did this without informing Dedan Kimathi. For Kimathi, this was nothing short of betrayal. The field marshal reacted swiftly. He allegedly ordered Mathenge's arrest, effectively a death warrant in the cutthroat world of the forest, where arrest could mean summary execution. It's worth noting that Kimathi, too, had his paranoid streak. He had accused other leaders of treason before. For example, he distrusted General China after China was captured and cooperated with the British. With Mathenge's unilateral outreach to the enemy, Kimathi's worst fears seemed confirmed. The two men were now on a collision course. Some Mau Mau fighters were fiercely loyal to Kimathi, others sided with Mathenge, whom they had followed for years. The unity of the rebellion was fraying at the top. By late 1955, the situation grew even more dire, not just due to internal rifts, but also because of intensifying British counter-insurgency. As pressure mounted, Kimathi's behavior grew erratic and desperate. At one point, with his power slipping, Kimathi began grandiosely calling himself Sir Dedan, and even Prime Minister of the liberated Kenya that had yet to materialize. Yes, you heard that right. He knighted himself, sir. Perhaps a touch of irony from a man fighting the British crown. Kimathi's self-promotion didn't do much to impress Mathenge. If anything, it probably reinforced Mathenge's view that Kimathi was losing touch with reality as the noose tightened around the Mau Mau. In the drama of the Aberdares, one could say there were two wars happening, one against the British Empire, and one a Cold War between Mathenge and Kimathi. We can only imagine some of the tense exchanges or indirect sniping that occurred between these two. Perhaps around a flickering fire at a leaders' meeting, Mathenge, wrapped in a blanket, scowled as Kimathi passionately declared no surrender and spoke of a unified command. Mathenge might have retorted that the fighters in Nyeri would not be anyone's pawns, not even Kimathi's, and that survival required flexibility. The rivalry never exploded into open combat between their factions, thankfully for the independence cause, but it set the stage for what happened next in Mathenge's story, his sudden disappearance. Dedan Kimathi, no surrender. Stanley Mathenge. The fighters in Nyeri will not be anyone's pawns, not even Kimathi's. Survival requires flexibility. While the Mau Mau leadership struggled with internal tensions, the British colonial government threw everything it had into crushing the rebellion. This was, after all, Britain's largest conflict in its African colonies, and they were determined to stamp it out. They deployed over 50,000 British troops, supplemented by tens of thousands of local auxiliaries and police. It became a massive counterinsurgency operation on Kenyan soil. One prong of the British strategy was to cut off the oxygen supply of the forest fighters, their contact with civilians. Beginning in 1954, the colonial authorities forced over 1 million Kikuyu peasants into fortified villages, which were essentially controlled camps surrounded by barbed wire and trenches. This drastic program, the villagization program, aimed to sever the Mau Mau from their support base. For people like Mathenge's wife, family, and sympathizers, this meant they could no longer move freely or provide food to the fighters without great peril. These new villages were heavily guarded by the pro-British Home Guard, consisting of African loyalists who often harbored old grudges against the Mau Mau. Under this regime, any Mau Mau attempting to slip into a village for supplies could be shot on sight or betrayed by informants. To further contain the insurgency, the British set up detention camps for suspected Mau Mau across the country. Tens of thousands of Kikuyu men and even women were detained in camps like Manyani, Hola, and Langata, where conditions were brutal. Interrogation, torture, forced labor, and disease were rampant. In one stark photo from the time, hundreds of Kikuyu detainees are seen crowded behind barbed wire at a camp, with a gallows ominously standing in the background, a grim symbol of the fate awaiting many rebel suspects. These were literally open-air prisons, as one historian described them. The idea was to drain the water to catch the fish, treating the entire Kikuyu population as potential Mau Mau collaborators. It was harsh collective punishment, and it indeed put immense pressure on the fighters in the hills, who found themselves increasingly isolated and starving. On the military front, the British employed superior firepower and technology. They had air supremacy, something the forest fighters could not counter. In 1953-55, The Royal Air Force carried out numerous bombing raids over the forest where Mau Mau squads were believed to be hiding. Hawker Hunter jets and Lincoln bombers would strafe and bomb dense forest zones suspected of harboring rebel camps. Now, pinpoint targeting in that terrain was nearly impossible. The forest canopy was thick, and the Mau Mau were highly mobile. But the British figured if they dropped enough explosives, they might get lucky. Stanley Mathenge, Dedan Kimathi, and other key Mau Mau leaders were explicitly targeted by these aerial bombing campaigns. The RAF would pre-plan strikes on areas they thought Mathenge might be, hoping to decapitate the insurgency from above. One RAF analysis later claimed this indiscriminate bombing policy was successful and undoubtedly accounted for the disappearance of Stanley Mathenge in 1955. In other words, the British believed their bombs either killed Mathenge or at least scattered his unit, causing him to flee. Whether or not a bomb actually landed on Mathenge's camp, the constant harassment from the skies took a heavy toll. Survivors recalled that the fighters were forced to stay on the move continuously to avoid being caught in bombardments, often abandoning food stores and bases to run for safety. Hunger became a relentless enemy. British aerial tactics combined with ground sweeps severely disrupted Mau Mau supply lines. Many guerrillas surrendered simply because they were starving and exhausted, citing hunger and the threat of being killed by bombing as their main reasons for giving up. Mathenge's forces in the Aberdares were no exception. By 1955, they were struggling. Food was scarce, ammunition low, and diseases like pneumonia lurked in the cold, wet highlands. On top of that, the British had a secret weapon, psychological warfare. They dropped propaganda leaflets from planes and blasted messages over loudspeakers in the forest, painting the Mau Mau as savage, twisted terrorists and urging fighters to surrender. The colonial government produced films and radio broadcasts, demonizing the rebels as Mau Mau monsters, deliberately masking the genuine grievances, land, freedom that the Mau Mau were fighting for. They also spread disinformation to sow distrust among rebel ranks. It's quite possible they tried to exploit the Mathenge-Kimathi rift, perhaps circulating rumors that one was betraying the other. The goal was to break their unity. By early 1956, the British counterinsurgency was showing results. The Mau Mau insurgency was effectively ground down. Dedan Kimathi, still on the run, found his loyal forces dwindling. He grew so desperate that he took to wearing a leopard skin and reportedly using charms, as if to ward off the inevitable. Mathenge's situation was equally untenable. Surrounded by enemies, betrayed by hunger, and with a price on his head from both the British and possibly Kimathi, the noose was tightening. Then came the pivotal moment. Stanley Mathenge disappeared. Sometime around late 1955 or early 1956, Stanley Mathenge vanished from the Aberdares. One day he was a thorn in the side of the British and a rival to Kimathi. The next, he was simply gone, as if the forest had swallowed him whole. To this day, exactly what happened remains one of Kenya's greatest unsolved mysteries. There are several competing theories and accounts. The flight to Ethiopia. According to Mau Mau lore and some eyewitnesses, Mathenge decided to escape the tightening trap by heading north. Legend has it that in 1956, as British forces gained the upper hand, Mathenge fled with a small band of about 28 fighters toward Ethiopia. The story goes that he intended to seek military assistance or sanctuary from Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. In those days, Ethiopia was independent and had provided some moral support to African anti-colonial movements. Mathenge's plan might have been to get arms, training, or even an exile base from which to continue the struggle. The group supposedly slipped out of Kenya through the arid northern frontier, a grueling journey on foot that, if true, speaks to Mathenge's determination and hope. Killed in action or by rivals. The British, as noted, believed their relentless campaign likely killed Mathenge, directly or indirectly, in 1955. It's possible Mathenge was caught in a bombardment or died in a firefight. However, notably, the British never produced his body or definitive proof of his death. In fact, British records after the war have no entry for Mathenge being killed or captured, which kept the mystery alive. Another dark possibility that some have whispered, Mathenge could have been eliminated by fellow Mau Mau due to the leadership feud. A conspiracy theory later circulated that Dedan Kimathi, or loyalists of his, might have assassinated Mathenge in the forest to remove the challenge to Kimathi's authority. According to this theory, Kimathi then concocted the story that Mathenge went to Ethiopia for help as a convenient cover-up. It sounds like something out of a thriller, and we have no evidence to confirm it, but it's one narrative that persists in some circles. Voluntary exile, living under a new identity. Yet another angle suggests Mathenge survived the war and chose never to return, possibly to avoid the inevitable post-war retribution or power struggles. If he did make it to Ethiopia, perhaps he found a peaceful, anonymous life there. Over the years, rumors trickled back that Mathenge was indeed alive in Ethiopia. Kenyan pilgrims and truck drivers passing through Ethiopia told tales of an old Kenyan man living in the highlands who claimed to be the Mau Mau general. These unconfirmed sightings kept the legend on a low simmer through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. In Kenya, meanwhile, the emergency officially ended in 1960. The Mau Mau had been defeated militarily. Dedan Kimathi had been captured in October 1956, with help from informants, ironically including former Mau Mau, and executed by hanging in February 1957. With Kimathi's death, the colonial government believed the chapter closed. They even celebrated by publishing photos of Kimathi in chains to trumpet their victory. But Mathenge's fate hung as an open question. British officers reportedly scratched their heads that they never got Mathenge, no arrest, no body. To many Kenyans, Mathenge's mysterious disappearance turned him into a kind of folk hero or spirit, the general who never surrendered, never died, at least not in colonial hands. Mothers could hush unruly children by evoking his name, and fighters who laid down arms could tell themselves, "Our general escaped. He's out there free." It was a small psychological solace after a bitter defeat. Back in Nyeri, Mathenge's family waited and wondered. His wife, Miriam Muthoni Mathenge, endured detention and hardship during the crackdown. She was even jailed at one point for refusing to renounce Mau Mau. After the war, she continued to hope that her husband would return home. Years became decades. Mathenge's brother, Joseph Mirugi, also held on to the belief that Stanley might be alive in exile. Joseph died in 2009 without ever learning his brother's true fate. Muthoni, Mathenge's wife, lived on into the 21st century, a living link to this saga, still waiting for answers in her old age. One curious claim emerged much later, that Stanley Mathenge lived to old age and died around 2016 in Ethiopia. However, this claim is hard to verify and might have been conflating Mathenge with someone else. The fact remains, from 1956 onwards, no confirmed trace of Mathenge was found. He had become a ghost, a name spoken with reverence and puzzlement but attached to no concrete tomb or testimony. Little did anyone expect that half a century later this ghost would seemingly walk out of the mist and into a media circus. Fast forward to 2003. Kenya, now an independent nation for 4 decades, was undergoing a political shift. A new president, Mwai Kibaki, had come to power, ending 24 years of Daniel Arap Moi's rule. Kibaki's government signaled a willingness to recognize Mau Mau veterans as freedom fighters, something previous regimes had been hesitant to do. In this climate, an astonishing news story broke. Stanley Mathenge had been found alive in Ethiopia. On May 30, 2003, Kenya's government flew in an elderly man from Ethiopia, presenting him as General Stanley Mathenge, the long-lost Mau Mau hero. The scene at Nairobi's Jomo Kenyatta International Airport was nothing short of historic. A red carpet was rolled out for the arrival of the supposed 84-year-old Mathenge. Dignitaries, politicians, and Mau Mau veterans thronged the airport, eager for a glimpse of this living legend who had cheated time. Some held tattered Mau Mau flags and old black and white photos, tears in their eyes at the thought that one of their greatest had returned. The man stepped off the plane, frail and bearded, leaning on a stick. He was given a hero's welcome. Crowds cheered, women ululated, and struggle songs from the 1950s echoed in the terminal. For Kenya, it was as if a chapter of history had miraculously reopened. The government really pulled out all the stops. The alleged Mathenge was treated as a state guest. He and a few family members who accompanied him were lodged in Nairobi's Pan-African Hotel for a week at government expense. He was even slated to be a guest of honor at the National Madaraka Day celebrations on June 1st, commemorating the day Kenya attained self-rule in 1963. The symbolism was powerful. Here was a Mau Mau fighter, denied recognition for so long, finally being honored on a national holiday. Kenya's media was abuzz. Front pages ran the headline, "Mathenge Returns," and TV stations looped footage of the airport welcome. But then, things got weird. During one of the private interactions, someone asked the soft-spoken old man to say a few words in Kiswahili, Kenya's national language, or in Kikuyu, the language of Mathenge's tribe. The expectation was that he'd thank the people or reminisce. However, the man looked confused. He could not speak or understand Kikuyu or Swahili. Instead, he spoke in Amharic, the language of Ethiopia. A hush fell among those listening. As these doubts surfaced, journalists and politicians began asking hard questions. It was soon revealed that the man's name was Lema Ayanu, an Ethiopian peasant farmer, and he had never actually claimed to be Mathenge in the first place. Apparently, the whole confusion started when a Kenyan man named George Milimo, living in Ethiopia, met this fellow in a bar in Addis Ababa. They got talking about Kenyan history, and Milimo noticed the Ethiopian had a keen interest. Jokingly or curiously, Milimo asked him if he knew Mathenge, and the man replied something like, "I am Mathenge," possibly misunderstanding the question or jesting. Milimo got excited and informed a Kenyan journalist, Joseph Karimi, who then broke the Mathenge is alive story. In the wave of optimism
and renewed Mau Mau recognition, the Kenyan authorities rushed to bring this man over, seemingly without thorough verification. Once in Kenya, the evidence against the man being Mathenge piled up quickly. Besides the language issue, Mau Mau veterans who met him were split. Some, like a few elderly fighters who wanted to believe, insisted he was Mathenge. "We slept in the same room with Mathenge during the war, we know him," one said, claiming to recognize him. But others pointed out obvious discrepancies, not just language, but appearance and memory. Mathenge's surviving sister Martha joyfully hugged the man at the airport, convinced it was her brother returned. In contrast, Mathenge's son, born before Mathenge went to the forest, visited Lema Ayanu in Ethiopia earlier and flatly said, "That's not my father." The public watched this spectacle unfold with equal parts fascination and skepticism. It became a national guessing game. Is he Mathenge or not? The Kenyan government, now in an awkward spot, quietly held off on the grand celebrations. President Kibaki did not meet the man as originally planned. State House indicated they would wait until the man's identity was verified. Lema Ayanu and his Ethiopian family members, meanwhile, were kept away from the media in their hotel, running up a notable bill on the government's tab. Jokes started circulating in newspapers and social gatherings. Was this a case of Mathenge, Kiswahili slang for confusion? Did the government just throw a hero's welcome for the wrong guy? Comedians had a field day, but many Kenyans were also genuinely disappointed. They had so badly wanted the story to be true. Parliament got involved. In 2007, a parliamentary committee disclosed the full truth. DNA tests had been conducted, using samples from Lema Ayanu and comparing them with DNA from Mathenge's known relatives, a brother and sister. The results were clear as day. There was no biological relation whatsoever. Additionally, Kenyan officials had even checked fingerprints against those on record from Mathenge's WWII service, further disproving any match. Lema Ayanu was indeed just Lema Ayanu. The Kenyan government had to admit that a diplomatic blunder had occurred. They had been mistaken in identifying him as Mathenge. In Parliament, MPs lambasted the officials who embarrassed the country by literally rolling out the red carpet for an impostor. One MP quipped how incredible it was that the whole government can make such a mistake, with local and international publicity, on what turned out to be fake. As for Lema Ayanu, the Kenyan authorities quietly sent him back to Ethiopia once the truth emerged. Interestingly, Lema Ayanu died in 2010 in Ethiopia. Despite the proof of his identity, Mathenge's widow, Miriam Muthoni, reportedly still wanted to give him a burial in Kenya, perhaps a sign of how desperately she yearned for closure, even if symbolic. The whole incident was a mix of tragedy and farce. On one hand, it brought Mau Mau veterans back into the limelight and showed Kenya's eagerness to honor them at last. On the other, it was a stark reminder that Stanley Mathenge's true fate remained unknown and likely would remain so. The Mathenge's back saga has since entered Kenyan pop culture as a cautionary tale of mistaken identity. Some saw poetic humor in it. Mathenge, the wily guerrilla, was so good at disappearing that even an entire government couldn't track him down 50 years later. Instead, they found a puzzled farmer who got a free trip to Nairobi. So what is Stanley Mathenge's legacy in Kenya's history? How does a man who played such a pivotal role in the fight for freedom end up as a largely forgotten figure, a footnote overshadowed by others? One reason is historical politics. After independence in 1963, Kenya's first government under President Jomo Kenyatta deliberately downplayed the Mau Mau's role in winning freedom. Kenyatta himself had been accused by the British of leading Mau Mau and jailed for it. But he had actually been more moderate and had a contentious relationship with Mau Mau fighters. Once in power, Kenyatta sought to unite Kenya and reassure the world by distancing his regime from the violent, radical image of Mau Mau. Moreover, Mau Mau was largely a Kikuyu-led movement, and Kenyatta, a Kikuyu, feared that overly celebrating Mau Mau would stoke ethnic division or portray his government as a Kikuyu ethnocracy. The new elite was also uncomfortable with Mau Mau's left-leaning anti-colonial rhetoric of land redistribution and social justice, things that didn't align with the direction the capitalist post-colonial state was taking. As a result, Mau Mau veterans were marginalized. They got no official recognition or compensation for years. Discussions of the Mau Mau rebellion were suppressed or frowned upon in official narratives. In this environment, Stanley Mathenge's name faded. Unlike Dedan Kimathi, who by virtue of being executed by the British became a martyr, and whose dramatic capture made him instantly legendary, Mathenge's ambiguous exit made him harder to memorialize. How do you honor a hero when you don't even know if he's dead or alive, or where he might be? There was also perhaps a subtle stigma. Some people, including surviving Mau Mau, questioned whether Mathenge had deserted the cause by leaving, or whether he had betrayed them by seeking surrender. Without clear answers, he occupied a grey area in history. Over the decades, while schools taught about Kimathi, Kenyatta, and other freedom fighters, Mathenge rarely made it into the textbooks. To be fair, Mathenge wasn't entirely erased. In Nyeri and the surrounding region, folk memories of his bravery persisted. A few roads were named after him. For instance, Mathenge Road exists in Nairobi, though many residents driving on it likely have no idea who he was. But beyond that, his legacy lived mostly in the fading recollections of old Mau Mau fighters swapping tales on sunlit afternoons. When former fighters formed associations in later years to lobby for recognition, Mathenge's story was occasionally invoked as one of the great unanswered questions of the struggle. It wasn't until the 2000s, when Kenya began reconciling with this buried part of its history, that Mau Mau heroes got their due. In 2003, Mau Mau was officially declared a legitimate freedom-fighting movement by the Kenyan government. Statues and monuments were erected. Notably, a statue of Dedan Kimathi now stands in central Nairobi, unveiled in 2007, the year Kimathi was finally reburied with honors. Yet, Mathenge did not get a statue or a national honor, perhaps because he wasn't there to receive it, or perhaps because the 2003 fiasco made any commemoration a bit awkward. His recognition remained subtle. In 2007, when veterans won a court case against the British government for abuses during the war, the focus was on the rank-and-file fighters and iconic leaders like Kimathi. Mathenge's contribution, organizing the war in the Aberdares, sustaining the fight in its early crucial phases, was rarely highlighted in official speeches. However, the intrigue around Mathenge's fate does continue to fascinate many. In Nyeri, locals still speculate in hushed tones about what truly happened. Did he start a new family in Ethiopia? Did he perhaps slip back into Kenya quietly and live under an alias? Unlikely, but who knows? Some younger Kenyans have rediscovered his story via blogs, YouTube, like this channel, and books, dubbing him Kenya's Lost General or the Vanished Mau Mau Warrior. One author called him a hero the world forgot, encapsulating the tragedy of an important figure left in the shadows. In a broader sense, Stanley Mathenge's legacy is a reminder of the complexity of the Mau Mau rebellion. Not all Mau Mau leaders had the same ideology or destiny. Kimathi became the poster child of the uprising, but Mathenge's parallel prominence shows Mau Mau was not a monolith. It had its internal politics, rival visions, and unsung champions. Mathenge embodies the countless fighters whose names we may never know, who gave everything and did not stick around for the victory party, Kenya's independence in 1963. Because there was no victory party for them, they either died, disappeared, or were marginalized as history marched on. Today, as Kenya and historians re-evaluate the Mau Mau War with more nuance, Mathenge is gaining recognition as one of the key architects of the armed resistance, a man whose battlefield prowess forced the British to sit up and take notice. In fact, the sustained Mau Mau insurgency, which Mathenge was instrumental in, is credited with accelerating Kenya's independence. British colonial files even acknowledge that by the late 1950s, governing Kenya without reform had become impossible, largely due to Mau Mau's impact. So in that sense, Mathenge's fight was not in vain. The freedom Kenyans enjoy owes a debt to those guerrillas in the forest. Sadly, Stanley Mathenge did not get to see that freedom, nor reap its fruits. Whether he died in 1955 under a hail of bombs, or lived until old age tending goats in some remote Ethiopian village, he never returned to the country he sacrificed so much for. His ultimate fate remains a clouded chapter, an enduring mystery that perhaps adds to his legend. As the veteran Field Marshal Muthoni Kirima, the only female Mau Mau Field Marshal, once said in an interview, Mathenge, he went like many into the forest and into God's hands, a poetic way to accept that some answers lie beyond our reach. In the end, we remember Stanley Mathenge as a patriot, a fearless commander, and a symbol of the many unsung heroes of the Mau Mau War and of the untold stories still lurking in history's underbrush. His life story, early courage, rising to leadership, principled stubbornness, rivalry, and a mysterious vanishing, is the stuff of epic cinema or indeed a Wandia Chronicles documentary. And as we conclude this saga, one cannot help but muse. Perhaps it's fitting that Mathenge slipped away into legend. He fought the good fight and never had to compromise or witness the messy aftermath of independence. In the collective memory, he remains eternally in the green forests, a tall, proud figure with rifle in hand and hope in heart, fading into the mist before the enemies could claim him. Thank you for journeying with us through the life and enigma of Stanley Mathenge. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please subscribe to Wandia Chronicles and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next story. We have many more hidden chapters of African history to explore together. Feel free to like and share this video, and tell us in the comments what you found most intriguing about Mathenge's story. And if you have family stories or theories about Mathenge, we'd love to hear them. Until next time, this is Wandia Chronicles signing off. Keep the history alive.